Hello there and welcome to Blues Truths, episode 3, the podcast that is half media review, half diary. Sort of. For this week's episode, I decided to discuss The Simpsons and my favourite episodes within that show. And in between, I'll probably be going on random personal anecdotes about my life because it's me and I'm a rambly arsehole. Anyway, let's dive straight in. So, my favourite episode of The Simpsons of all time is most likely the Springfield Files, which, on paper, doesn't necessarily sound like a good episode idea because it's a crossover between The Simpsons and The X-Files, if you couldn't catch that from the title there. And Simpsons crossovers kind of have a bad rep now, I guess you could say. I mean, with the immediate people I talked to, they weren't necessarily a big fan of the whole Family Guy Simpsons crossover thing. And there was that one episode where The Simpsons did a crossover with The Critic, that since forgotten show that was made by, I believe, one of the Simpsons producers, well, former producers now, I guess. And that episode caused so much controversy as to make Matt Groening remove his name in the opening credits. So, Simpsons crossovers haven't necessarily been the best, but this episode, for me, is a definite favourite of mine. And this goes way back to when I was, probably about 6 years old and watching this episode for the first time. And it's funny because when this episode first came on, my parents turned to me and they're like, "Oh, this is the episode that scared your sister. Are you sure you're going to be okay watching this one?" At the time, I was thinking to myself, of course I'll be fine watching this episode. My sister's a bloody sissy for being scared of this. Anyway, fast forward a few minutes. We get that wonderful scene where Homer leaves the bar and the suspense starts to slowly build. People who've seen the episode know what I'm talking about here. The scenery is dark. This is set at nighttime and Homer's walking down this street and the music slowly builds, and there's all these sort of cliche trappings in here as well. Like, I believe you hear an owl, and it's really well done and it feels really classical in the way that it builds suspense, like the sort of old school horror sci-fi vibe to this whole thing. And it's perfectly done by the Simpsons creative team. Anyway, Homer walks down this dark street and this visual gag comes on where the Springfield Philharmonic bus goes past, and there's this whole concert on there playing dun, 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 you know, the suspenseful music, and Homer stumbles into this forest, trips, and comes face to face with this alien figure. At least that's what you're led to believe in the early parts of this episode. And my god, something about this alien scared the absolute living shit out of me because I couldn't handle it. It was so frightening to me at the time. And looking back on it in retrospect, I think I can kind of have a decent understanding as to why this is, because there's something about that design, the really big eyes that falls into the uncanny valley, I reckon. You know, the uncanny valley being this idea that something resembles a human, but is just slightly off to the point of it becoming unnerving in a way. And I think this character design definitely fits into that category. At least it did for the younger me at the time. And it's also that voice, that really creepy, childlike voice that the alien has, where it's like, "Hello there, don't be afraid." Still to this day, it kind of gives me chills in a way. I remember being at this friend's, I can't remember exactly what the event was. I think it was a movie night where I ended up staying the whole night with my friend. And it was getting kind of late. I think it was like 1 or 2 in the morning. And I was talking to my friend about The Simpsons. We were just having a casual conversation about it. And then I was like, "Hey, did you ever watch the Springfield Files? It's my favourite episode." Then I remember him responding with, "My god, that episode scared the shit out of me." And this prompted us to search up the episode on YouTube. Well, we prompted us to look for a clip of the episode on YouTube, and it was that clip I was just describing before, where Homer first discovers the alien, and right there in that moment, we were both just like, ugh. We still managed to feel chills about it at 2 in the morning at this movie night event. which I find quite funny. And I find that it's often the case with things that properly scared you when you were younger. It kind of sticks with you in a way. It's strange that, and maybe that's just a thing for me, but I think that might be universal in a way. Who knows? But anyway, moving back onto this episode, this scene was so frightening to me that my parents had to turn off the TV because I was very visibly shaken by it, and it stuck with me for weeks and weeks afterwards. I specifically remember that my parents kind of had this... There was this split for a while there between them. It's fine now, they rekindled it. But for a while there was this split, meaning that my mum was living in this house, this brand new house I'd never been in before. So nights where I'd stay at her place were quite unnerving to me because there was this brand new house in this street that was kind of dodgy that I kind of weren't aware of. I think as a kid I sort of visualized this street as the hood in a way, this sort of area where I felt underplaced and it felt dangerous, which is, dear God, that definitely wasn't the case. It's actually quite hipster now. There's lots of nice cafes and the like. But at the time I felt very frightened. And I remember that at nights when I was sleeping alone in this big bedroom, the first thought that would come to mind was this alien from the Springfield Files. And it would deeply scare me. I couldn't get to sleep just thinking about it. And I remember one night where I was having this really distinct nightmare where I was in the snow and I was with a group of people and one of them starts to get a bit weary. And I go up to him and I ask, like, what's wrong? And he says, oh, the alien's coming. We've all got to hide. We've got to drop down, not move, because if you don't move, he won't know you're there, but as soon as you move, he'll be able to catch you. That was the sort of idea here. So we all drop down, me included, and the alien comes up behind us, and then I move and snap, I'm awake. It's terrifying. Even looking back on it, what a shitty thing for my head to do. Thanks for creating that horrible nightmare scenario. So for the following weeks in this house, I had this nightmare in my head, and it was a bit of a disaster. I was so deathly afraid. And as the weeks went by, this episode would play on repeats, and I started to do certain safekeeping things in order to be aware of whether this episode was playing or not. For example, I memorized the chalkboard gag. The truth is not out there. I still remember it. So then when that gag comes on, I can switch the channel. But sometimes the channel would come onto it, because the way it worked growing up is the Simpsons would play after the 6 o'clock news. And I remember always being incredibly bored with this 30-minute news program. I would be like, oh, come on, just finish so I can watch the fucking Simpsons already. This is important to me. Because The Simpsons was a show that, for the first 2 years that I was aware of it, I wasn't allowed to watch it. Because my parents were like, whoa, this is adult entertainment, you can't see this. But then eventually they kind of just... They let me do it. They realized that it's pretty much harmless. I also didn't understand the majority of the adult humor in it anyway. It's one of those scenarios where I came back to watch episodes many years later and finally started getting the jokes and being like, oh my god, that completely went over my 6 or 7-year-old mind. I love it when that happens. It happens quite often with kids' movies as well. I'll be watching something like Finding Nemo and go, wow, they really snuck in some dirty jokes in there, huh? It's great. I love doing things like that. Anyway, to go back to the episode at hand here, it became this tradition of mine where I'd be able to work out what was going on, whether this is the episode I was scared of or not, early on. And if I missed the chalkboard gag somehow, like if we switched to the channel and it was midway through the opening, I had another way of being able to work out whether it was the right episode or not, and that was that opening scene with Leonard Nimoy and the music that plays. Because as soon as this caricature of Leonard Nimoy appears on screen, the sort of jingle comes on. And it's this jingle that's embedded in my brain because I would hear that and instantly think, this is it. And I would either run out of the room or turn off the TV. And I remember one time, because we had this really massive TV, one of those ones that has this giant back. Like, this isn't the cool flat screen TV, this is the massive monolith from the 90s, or whatever decade this TV was from. So I'd go up to the TV and I would push this massive button and try and turn it off, but sometimes the button wouldn't work, and that was a horrifying experience for me. Just me constantly pressing this button, being like, come on, turn off. And I remember one time it wasn't working, so I ran into my room and tried to fall asleep. Because that was a weird thing I would do if I encountered something scary on TV. I'd sprint to my room and just try to sleep it off, which is a odd thing, but hey, what can I say? I have no idea what I was thinking at the time. Like, it would be early, it would be like 6:30 or something. Normally I'd go to sleep a few hours later, but no, that was it. I'm scared now, I'm gonna go ahead and sleep this off, I guess. And with this opening scene, it's so wonderful. The whole beginning of this episode is wonderful. Not only do we have this really great cameo by Leonard Nimoy, which is one of my favourite cameos in the whole of The Simpsons. It's so funny, and he plays it in such a dry, serious way that elevates the comedy to a whole nother level. He's one of the most, for me personally, one of the most treasured guests on all of The Simpsons, and they've had quite a few belters here and there. I'll be talking about Johnny Cash's contribution to this a little bit later in my second favourite episode of The Simpsons. But with this beginning, you've got some really great memorable gags. You've got that one where Homer's describing the movie Speed and somehow forgets his title, where he says something like, it was a movie about a bus that couldn't slow down its speed. And if it did slow down the speed, and he just keeps on mentioning speed in all these different sentences, and says something like, I believe it was called the bus that couldn't slow down. It's just, the beginning almost feels disconnected from the later plot in a way, because it's just a selection of onslaught of gag after gag after gag, and these range from the just witty vocal sense, like what I said before, where it's just the script being funny in terms of dialogue, and it's also visual. Like, there's that awesome sequence where Marge is looking at a magazine of better homes than yours, and the way it's set out is that you see the magazine cover and then it kind of pans out into the actual Simpsons living room, so it's quite clever. There are gags of all different kinds, and almost all of them just fire. So it builds up this really cozy atmosphere here, where it's Friday night, everyone's getting really excited. It just feels good, and I always loved that atmosphere growing up as well, watching this episode. Sometimes it would be a Friday when they aired it, and I could relate to that feeling quite heavily. It's really nicely captured here. Anyway, eventually I decided to revisit this episode because I was no longer scared of it. I had gotten older now, I felt braver, and I decided it's time to rewatch this. So what I did is I went down to our local DVD rental place. A place that had a carpeted floor, and quite often I'll just go there wearing no shoes and in my pajamas, because clearly I didn't give a fuck. Back then, wow. Anyway. And I remember that the way they set out these Simpsons DVDs is that instead of having legitimate DVDs, what they'll do is they'll just burn various discs and have like these blank DVD covers with Texter written on it, because I don't know, I guess they didn't want people to damage original DVDs. They wanted to be able to have mass versions of them. I'm not too sure why this place did it, to be honest. Anyway, I'm rambling as per usual, but what I'll do is I'll look at the back of each individual DVD, look through the episode list, and then try and find the one that I was looking for. Usually it'll be Treehouse of Horror episodes. Anyway, I look at the back of the certain DVD and I find the Springfield Files, and I'm like, that's it. That has to be the one. I remember all the different X-Files references throughout it. So I place it in at home, and it instantly becomes my favourite episode. I love the sci-fi elements of the plot, as someone who's always been a big fan of sci-fi in general. The whole atmosphere of it I think is great, the directing, and it just becomes my ultimate favourite. And I'm about 10 or 11 at this stage. And also distinctly remember at this stage, about a week after I'd watched it at home, I had this revelation about it being possibly my favourite thing ever. I was a little bit obsessed. I remember talking to these people on my desk when I was in like grade 4 or something about this episode, and I made a joke or something about like, oh yeah, that episode used to, it used to scare my sister, but I'm not scared of it in particular. And while I was saying this, for some reason I was shaking. I don't know why, but then I remember a guy next to me being like, hey look, he's shaking, he must have been scared of it too, and instantly snapped into being defensive, like, what are you talking about? I was never scared of that, making it quite obvious that I was. Very smooth tactic there, Blue, smooth tactic. I'm gonna call myself Blue, because last episode I used my real name in various circumstances. Fucking damn it. Anyway, so I discovered this episode as my favourite thing ever, and I decided to introduce it to my best friend at the time. And after watching it with him, he decided that it was his favourite on a completely different level to me, because he found it hilarious. And not just all those jokes I was talking about, like the visual gags and the clever dialogue. He found the actual representation of the alien itself really, really funny. Something about that high-pitched voice and the design just made him laugh out loud. So watching it for him was this really wonderful experience, but it was just like, what is this crazy alien thing? And this struck me as really surreal, seeing someone just laughing in the face of something that caused me so much fucking grief as a kid. So he had this very different relationship with it, and we related on this quite heavily. We were so in love with this episode that it became this sort of tradition for us to just hang out in my back room and watch it. And we did it so much to the point where one of our friends one time got really angry at us when we were like, hey, you know what we should do? Let's watch that episode for the 500th time in total. Well, probably more than that, in all honesty. And then I remember her storming out of my house into the front yard just so she could avoid having to watch this episode again. Because we did it that much. And we decided that we both wanted a sort of memorabilia from this episode, one way or another. So what we did is we literally sewed our own aliens from this episode, where we got bits of fabric, we drew an outline, we did like the goofy little eyes and stuff, put some, what did we put in? We put some stuffing into it, and then sewed together our own little toys, our own little plushy toys of the alien from that episode. And I remember us coming out of the room and showing my mum and being like, hey look, it's Mr. Burns. And she had no knowledge of this being the alien version of it that we were trying to depict, because at the end of the episode it's revealed that it's Mr. Burns actually been going through all this weird therapy. That's what's creating the alien. And she kind of just looked at it and went, oh, cool. Looking back at it, she was probably thinking to herself, how the fuck is this Mr. Burns? Which is pretty funny looking back at it now. But anyway, it became this thing that was very integral to us, and it was almost integral to our friendship in a way, because we spent a lot of time talking about and just rewatching this thing and having a great time every single time it aired. And it's still to this day, it holds up remarkably well. Like I said, you have that you have that first act where it's just a bunch of jokes and it has this very great sort of comfy Friday night atmosphere. I absolutely adore it. And then the middle section comes in, and this is when the plot elements start to come to play. This is when Homer just after Homer's discovered the alien and he's talking about it with his family, no one really believes him, and the X-Files come to investigate. And I just love the inclusion of Mulder and Scully into this. Somehow they work really well in the world of The Simpsons, something that I wouldn't have believed if you told me this, with me having no prior knowledge of this episode at all. But the two actors play it in such a deadpan way when they kind of speak like this, and it works really well, and it lends itself to a lot of very dry comedy. So this middle section has them investigating the alien, and it's really great, and it's both rich in a narrative sense and also in a comedic sense. And there's a few gags that still to this day, many years later, I finally got. Like, this episode keeps on unraveling itself to me over the years. For example, I never got because the way the X-Files works is that when it transitions onto a new scene, there'll be this sort of text that appears. And the way that the text is done is that it reveals itself like typewriter. It sort of types itself out like... And there's a scene outside the pub in one of the scenes of the episode where the text comes out and it says, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And I never got that reference until later on when I was about 16 years old. and I watched The Shining, and it's just funny how all these jokes slowly but surely reveal themselves to me, making it a very rich episode for me. Anyway, this third act comes to play, where everyone decides to go to the area where the supposed alien is. They discover it's Mr. Burns. Leonard Nimoy appears yet again, and it just ends on this really bizarre sequence of all these different characters linking arms and singing the song. Well, a song that has a chorus that goes, "Good morning, starshine." It's this really wonderful way to end the episode, and it purposely encapsulates everything that makes it so wonderful. And just recently, just for the fun of it, I was going on to IMDb and I was looking through what the website considered the best Simpsons episodes based on all the different user ratings. And I went through, and Simpsons Springfield Files was one of the top, and it most certainly deserves that spot. It's a really creative, fun episode that feels almost out of place in the Simpsons catalogue in a very wonderful way. It's definitely recommended. Now, before I mentioned how I was 10 years old and talking about the Springfield Files on my desk, and there was a very specific reason as to why I was talking about The Simpsons with everyone, because at this time in my life, there was kind of a bit of a Simpsons fever in my class, and this was specifically because we sort of got into this thing of trading Simpsons comics with each other. And at first, this is just a friendly thing, because we had this trading culture in our school for a while there. At first, it was with these things called Mighty Beans, but eventually it became Simpsons comics, where we would all come into class with all the different comics, whether it be the Treehouse of Horror ones, I think there was like Bartman comics in there as well, just a whole assortment of different Simpsons comics, and we would swap them with each other. I'd go, alright, I'll give you Treehouse of Horror number 6 if you give me Simpsons number 44 or whatever. It played out like that. But eventually, as these things always do, things got a bit messy. People started to regret the fact that I traded in all these different comics, and there were tears and arguments. I didn't really want to give you Simpsons Treehouse of Horror number 6. I actually yada yada yada. All these different things erupted from this, causing our teacher at the time to be like, that's it. This whole Simpsons comics trading thing is causing too many issues. People keep on wanting their stuff back, and it's just, it's a disaster. You've got to stop doing this. So, of course, instead of us stopping, we started to do it in secret. So in a way, there was this sort of secret Simpsons gambling sect that started up at our school. And in particular, I remember one time, I desperately wanted this massive big omnibus of the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, and I still have this one to this day. This one I got off this poor kid, and I was trying to get it off him somehow. So what I decided to do instead was trade this Garfield comic that I had bought in, this one that I didn't really care about much at the time. So I passed him this little shitty Garfield comic, and I'm like, here you go, I'll give you this for this massive Simpsons omnibus. And at the time, he's just like, yeah, sure, why not? And as I was passing it to him, somehow I flick onto the first page, and I remember this so distinctly, because the first page in marker had my name poorly written into it, because this, and all these memories came flooding back of how important this little Garfield book to me was when I was 4 years old, and I'd written my name into it, because I was like, yeah, this is my book, this is special to me, let's put our name into it. And getting that sudden flood of nostalgia as I gave it to him kind of upset me in a way. I remember thinking in my head, what am I doing? What am I giving up? Why are we all doing this? This is sick. This whole trading thing is sick. And after that, I stopped. Never again would I be trading Simpsons comics. And still to this day, I have his massive omnibus. Like, in my bookshelf the other day, I was going through it and I found it. And I flicked to the first page, and sure enough, there's his name written there in poor handwriting with texture. So it comes full circle in a way. So these Simpsons comics really meant a lot to us at this time. And I remember one time where I was at this school sleepover, and this was 2 years before the whole Simpsons gambling incident that I just mentioned. But I was at this school sleepover, and I bought in this Treehouse of Horror issue. And I remember my teacher discovering it and being so horrified by it. He was flicking through the pages and he was thinking, oh my god, who would read this? And this caused a lot of controversy and a ban in me being allowed to bring in these comics for that year. Anyway, enough weird anecdotes about the comic side of thing. Let's dive into my second favourite episode of The Simpsons, and this one's called The Mysterious Voyage of Homer. And yet again, this one is an episode that I have a lot of distinct memories of. And this is specifically because it made me very uncomfortable. And let's kind of go through the motions here of how this episode works. So, the first act of this episode, it begins in this scene where Marge is trying very hard to hide something from Homer. She cuts out a segment of the newspaper. She purposely starts vacuuming really loud, and Homer gets a phone call that might alert him to what's going on. And eventually, as the scene plays out, we find out that there's this massive chili cook-off special going on, and Marge is reluctant to let Homer go because the year previous, I think it was, stated in the episode, the year previous Homer had gotten really drunk and just made a complete fool out of himself. So sure enough, she was reluctant to let him go. Eventually, she lets in and they go to this chili cook-off, and what plays here is yet again a brilliant assortment of gags. My personal favourite being when Homer goes to Ned Flanders' chili stand, where it says that it's, what did it say? It said that it was 5-alarm chili. So Homer goes to try it, and then it ends up being 2-alarm chili, prompting him to say something like, hey, hold on a second, this isn't 5-alarm chili, making Ned feel really guilty in the process. And I remember one of the kids in this scene being like, Daddy, are we going to go to jail? And he just responds with, I don't know, son, I don't know. And I always found that strikingly funny, even from a very young age. To explain more about the scene, Homer ends up coming across this really intense chili that Chief Wiggum has cooked up. And needless to say, eating this chili causes a very profound effect on Homer. And by that I mean, it makes him trip balls. He has this really heavy hallucination, which plays into what is quite honestly my favourite sequence in the whole of The Simpsons. And this is just this massive 4-minute hallucination, and it is wonderful. I remember reading that this whole sequence was done by one single person because he didn't trust anyone else being able to accomplish the sequence. So, this is all done by one man, and it's incredibly visually arresting. It's one of the most unforgettable moments in the whole of the first 10 seasons of the show, because as we all know, after season 10, The Simpsons becomes something completely different, and it's not the same show, and none of those episodes count. Anyway, this whole sequence plays out like this really surreal nightmare. Like, Homer's eyes start appearing in and out of his head, his arms start twisting around in these bizarre, strange motions. There's that great moment where every time he walks forward, the sun moves up, and every time he walks backwards, the sun moves down. As well as a whole pyramid appearing out of thin air, his eyes popping all over the place. It's all incredibly well done and quite beautiful. I find myself often going onto YouTube and watching this 4-minute sequence again and again and again, because it's such a great showcase of animation that you can't help but be impressed by almost every time you see it. And the music plays into this too. There's this sort of western tang throughout all the music. It reminds me a bit of the sort of stuff you'd find in the background on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but more subtle, and it plays into this really well, especially with the setting being this desert, western type place. And when I mentioned earlier that this episode made me uncomfortable, it's this specific moment. This is after Homer's decided to follow this tortoise, and he climbs up this massive pyramid, and at the top he discovers Marge standing there, and he tries to get Marge's attention, and he starts noticing that she's not responding, so he runs to try and get Marge's attention. As he's running, she just keeps on spinning around and around and around, and you soon notice that she has no facial features whatsoever, and he just spins around and around, and then eventually she disappears into dust. And this was the scene that made me so uncomfortable as a kid. There's something about seeing this familiar character being portrayed with no face and disappearing into dust that made me incredibly uncomfortable. Yet again, it was that sort of uncanny valley feel that was being portrayed here. And Homer being so desperate to get her attention also just makes for this really eerie viewing experience. And looking back on it now, it's just a wonderful visual metaphor and visual setup for what's to come. But as a kid, I couldn't really understand what was going on here, and it was a very sort of moment for me at the time. And later on, I was talking to my friend about this episode, and she, before I could even mention it, was like, do you remember that scene where Marge had no face? That was really quite scary to me as a kid. So I feel like this is almost a universal thing for quite a lot of people that grew up watching this episode in this era of The Simpsons. Anyway, soon later, Space Coyote starts to materialize, and this is played by Johnny Cash. Now, I mentioned earlier that I thought that Leonard Nimoy did this amazing cameo, and he most certainly did. I still stand by that 100%, but this right here is possibly my favourite Simpsons cameo of all time, because the Space Coyote is played by Johnny Cash, and he does such a wonderful portrayal here. He's just got such a nice, smooth voice, which fits this sort of character that he has to portray here really fucking well. Because another thing I love about this is the fact that the Space Coyote is supposed to be this sort of cool, collected shaman type character, but it also has these very wild instincts that come into play when he just randomly starts gnawing on Homer's leg, and it's really funny. And I think he responds with something like, well, I am a coyote after all. And apparently they originally had Bob Dylan in mind when they wanted to cast the Space Coyote, and as much as that would have been wonderful to see, I'm kind of glad that they didn't, because Johnny Cash does a wonderful job. Like I said, possibly the best cameo in The Simpsons. Just great job. Anyway, so the Coyote tells Homer that he needs to find his soulmate, and this confuses Homer at first because he's thinking to himself, well, my soulmate, well, he isn't thinking to himself, he's saying it out loud that his soulmate is so clearly Marge. So the Coyote goes away, and this train comes out of thin air flying into Homer, and there ends the most imaginative and visually rich moment in the whole of The Simpsons. Like, if you haven't seen this episode before, it's worth watching just for this. So after that, Homer wakes up in this golf course, and as he's moving about, he realizes that everything he saw was just a vision, and then he starts to realize that the things around him are what probably caused a lot of the imagery that he saw. For example, he sees this store that's at the top of this big pyramid, so that explains the random pyramid he saw. And then he walks past this dog, and he's like, of course, the coyote was just a talking dog. And this dog responds with, hello, Homer. And then he goes, wait a second, dogs can't talk. And this dog that just talked before responds with a woof, and Homer goes, damn straight. And it's just, me paraphrasing these jokes is completely fucking killing them, but you get what I mean. It's a wonderfully funny joke, and just it goes to show how tight The Simpsons was at this time, because this episode resides in season 8, straight after the Springfield Files, coincidentally enough, my other favourite episode. And season 8 is possibly my favourite out of all of The Simpsons. It's when a lot of the cracks started to show, but the humour here was just really tight, and fit perfect to my sensibilities as well. So what follows afterwards is why I think that The Simpsons succeeds so well compared to other family animated sitcoms that it's often compared to. And when I say family, I mean sitcoms showing family dynamics, like that of Family Guy, or even South Park to a degree. And this is the fact that The Simpsons had quite a lot of heart. Like, some of the most iconic scenes are the one at the end of Maggie Makes Free, where Homer has that do it for her sign placed in his office, and that moment at the end of the episode Mother Simpson where Homer's sitting on the top of his car just staring at the stars. The Simpsons had a lot of emotional, heartfelt moments that elevated this from more than just a comedy satire into something that had quite a lot of rich emotion to it as well that could be portrayed. And comparing this to something like Family Guy makes it seem almost hollow in a way. Like, sure, Family Guy can be funny, but it never quite matches the sense of heart and emotion The Simpsons could very much portray. And this episode has that in spades, because Homer has this fight with Marge, which is understandable enough because when he's going crazy after eating that chili, she thinks that meant that he was drunk yet again and broke her promise to not make a complete fool out of himself this time as well. So what proceeds is this fight between them. The rest of the episode is Homer trying to find his soulmate. It's so easy to sympathize with him while also being very quite funny in this moment, because it has this really great montage that appears. And the episode ends with Homer finding this lighthouse, and he thinks to himself, a lighthouse, maybe the person up there will be my soulmate. Someone who mans the lighthouse must be very lonely, like he is in that moment. So he goes to the top of this lighthouse, and eventually he realizes that the lighthouse is actually manned by a computer, which is a reference to the Twilight Zone, another show that meant a ton to me as a kid. And maybe that's an episode for another time, but Homer's at the top of this lighthouse, and eventually Marge finds him, and there's this really great, quite tender scene between them where they reconcile after the fight. And what's great about this sequence is that Homer started to doubt whether Marge was his soulmate because they had such differences, like the record collection, for example. But in this moment, Marge explains to him that it's their differences that bring them closer together, and it's really soppy and sweet, but it feels well earned, because you love these characters, and you really feel for them in moments where they have conflict together. And it's so gorgeously portrayed, and like I said, it's an element of The Simpsons that is even missing the later seasons, but made the first seasons work so brilliantly. And it's that sense that beneath it all, that beneath all the comedy, there is this great big beating heart, and it stands at the forefront of a lot of the stories, and it adds a lot of depth. So yeah, those are my 2 all-time favourite episodes of The Simpsons. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, despite it being incredibly rambly as always. The Simpsons is just a show that meant so much to me back when I was younger and still means a great deal today, and hopefully you'll check out these 2 episodes if you haven't seen them already. They're outliers in The Simpsons catalogue, I guess, but they perfectly portray everything that it was and why it was so brilliant and is considered iconic today. Especially check out the second one I mentioned in that surreal midsection. Words cannot do justice to how much of a wonderful animation showcase it truly is. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed listening, and I'll see you guys in the next one.